Okay, so for this afternoon's session we have two presentations. So there'll be a presentation with some short rapid-fire questions, followed by the second presentation. So for the first presentation, I would like to welcome Craig Lockwood, who is the Director of Implementation Science at JBI. He is the Chair of the JBI Scientific Committee and Co-Chair of the JBI Implementation Science Methods Group. He is the Chief Editor of JBI Evidence Implementation and of BMC Systematic Reviews. They're both international peer-reviewed journals that publish manuscripts encompassing systematic reviews, synthesis, methodology and methods, as well as implementation and implementation science within a healthcare context that advance the theoretical, methodological and measurements aspects of healthcare practice. He'll be presenting today, his presentation is titled Implementation, Advancing Science Through Co-Contribution, Business as Usual. So please join me in welcoming Craig Lockwood.
I just love working with this JBI team, to work in such a culturally strong and dynamic place full of open inquiry is fantastic. Look, I put this talk together really thinking about the collaboration and about implementation science in our team in Adelaide. So myself, Alexa, Lucy Lynn, Alex, Camilla, just to thinking about where and how we grow things. And then the talks we've had this morning have been really interesting because they follow the mode of thinking about research that has grown from very strong traditional bases. That is, you do research, or we see that the world does research, and there can sometimes be a disconnect between the world of doing research and what is the application side of that, right? But I know a lot of you have studied JBI's approach to implementation, and I think this is the right moment, if you don't mind, that we just pay respects to Professor Alan Pearson, who, when we began the planning and development of implementation, it wasn't implementation science per se, it was implementation in the raw, if I could say that. So it was always there. It was always positioned to respond to clinical questions, to needs and priorities in health services, and then what is the best method to most pragmatically come in and help address those needs. So we've come from an amazing spot, and my job in this talk is to try and convince people that the application is great, but what are some challenges we can throw ourselves organisationally and as a global implementation science community to think more about what would it look like for us to build strategies for inquiry, either formally or informally, into the already deeply engaged clinical practices and processes that we use through the Evidence Implementation Training Program. So that's what I want to do. I don't know if it'll work, but that's what I'd like to do. All right, this guy will look familiar to you. In December 1999, Albert Einstein, the great physicist, was honoured by Time magazine as Man of the Century. It seems an inconceivable title today. I'm sure it was appropriate and apt at the time. And there are many, many stories about his life, the man, his life, etc., etc. One of them, though, involved him catching a train from Princeton, and this is in the days where they had a conductor and you got a ticket and someone had to punch your ticket, right? So it's that era. So the conductor's coming down the aisle checking and punching tickets for every passenger, and he gets to Albert Einstein, who reaches into his pocket and it's not there. So then he does that, like lean forward, reach into your pants pocket, and he couldn't find his ticket there either. And he just was looking and he couldn't find it, so he opened his briefcase and he shuffled through and he still couldn't find it. And then he looked at the seat next to him and it wasn't on the seat either. So he didn't know at all where his ticket was. And the conductor, a little embarrassed, said, Dr. Einstein, I know who you are. We all know who you are. I'm sure you bought a ticket. Don't worry about it. And Einstein just nodded appreciatively. and the conductor went on his way punching tickets. But as he got to the end of that carriage, he looked back, and there's Einstein on the floor, head down, bum up, looking under the seat. So the conductor came back, rushing back, and he goes, Dr. Einstein, don't worry, we know who you are, it's okay. You don't need a ticket, I'm sure you bought one. Einstein looked at him and said, young man, I too know who I am. What I don't know is where I'm going. And I have to admit, I have no Einstein, like you know me, right? I have no Einsteinian pretensions whatsoever. But I figure if Einstein, man of the century, can be caught head down, bum up on a train, wondering where he's going, then maybe a talk today thinking about JBI's current positioning and our future, like in terms of implementation science, could be forgiven for looking slightly similar in posture, metaphorically at least. So a little bit of inquiry and prose just to work and think that through. This is me. I'm speaking on behalf of my team, Lucy Lynn and Alexa as well. My academic work is paid by a Cat 3 grant, and I do other work which is unrelated to this presentation, and that is paid work as editor-in-chief for a number of journals. In issue 3 of the 2023 release of JBI Evidence Implementation, which I'm sure you've all read the editorial, I wrote about the desire to make things work, because there's this essential characteristic of modern life that we all depend on systems, on assemblages of people and technologies, and horrifically, sometimes combinations of people and technology, to try and make life work. And often half the time, our difficulty isn't either people or technology, it's just making one of those things work well for our lives. We have this desire to make things work, or in JBI's case, to make implementation work. And as I was just reflecting in the opening of this talk, most of what JBI has done has been in the very applied descriptive domain in terms of implementation. With innovation in the research side of things, perhaps lagging somewhere behind. Not lost, but definitely lagging somewhere in the distance. So that's interesting because the ingredients for study for the science of implementation are all around us. Across the JBIC, we have a diverse professional workforce. We are cross-cultural, cross-geographic, cross-service setting. In every way imaginable, the opportunity to capitalise on existing data and to adapt and implement new methods is right there, is low-hanging fruit. It's a rich source for future inquiry to deepen our understanding of contexts. It's often been said that the research practice gap is attributable to the challenges of integrating evidence into practice. And I take nothing away from that. I don't necessarily believe 17 years is a rational basis for change or for arguing for change, but at least we understand there is a gap. But a lot of work has already been done, and it's amazing work. We have more confidence today than we've ever had before about, for example, the factors that help explain the barriers between evidence and application to policy and practice. We've not had that privilege for very long, but we know it now with a fair degree of certainty. And we can say that there is a recognisable lack of specific knowledge or education that is available, that there are ingrained attitudes and behaviours that are hard to change, that organisational resources are challenged. We've moved away from saying, well, some of us have moved away from saying, no time, no money, no staff. But that used to be the trio that underpinned our call for action. But we've moved away from that because the science has moved on substantially, and that's a very good thing. We have, right from the beginning, or as Lisa Hopp would say, right from the get-go, relied on audit and feedback as a well-recognised approach to implementation and has been since at least the early 2000s. The model of delivering EITP, we call it now, Clinical Fellowship previously, has developed a significant and rich body of knowledge, slightly untapped as yet, across countries, cultures, and contexts. These programs are operationalised through clinical academic partnerships and always have been. They are the nexus for some really interesting engagements, academics working at the point of care with practitioners on how to localise organisationally important topics, sharing skills, resources, and participating in knowledge transfer, supported by an implementation framework informed by audit and feedback. These are like significant developments in our planning of the applied side of evidence-based practice. Clinical topics that can and are readily amendable to this, I nearly said simple approach to change. But in the world of implementation science, it sometimes feels like audit and feedback is the ugly duckling that hasn't quite grown up yet. And I think I've probably got that wrong, given what I heard Maureen say earlier today about case study versus randomised controlled trials. But look at some of these kinds of topics that you can address using audit and feedback. And these are across diverse settings as well. So this is impressive thinking. You've got to ask though, from audit and feedback when it's localised, and this has been a theme from today so far, is around what is the organisational impact? Is there one? Or is this an isolated piece of work that goes no further than the 16-bed bay that it was conducted in? So what would that even look like? Well, I imagine organisational impact would be characterised by a wider impact than the immediate site where the audit was done. And I've had a look at some of the data from our published implementation reports on this. So here's the analysis of that data presented as a visual. This is, of course, informed by GRIP, Getting Research into Practice, which is a guided situational analysis software program that allows groups to identify barriers and plan strategies to address them. And you'll note from this schema that there's a fairly high level of engagement and stakeholder networking and participation that is actually quite typical of a JBI implementation project. These are based on recent implementation case studies led by clinicians, and sure, more analysis and mapping would be handy, but what we can see here already is these are clinicians who are negotiating with senior leadership to confirm their topics, to pre-plan, and to engage organisationally and ensure that their work is not isolated. There is a high level of broad stakeholder identification, engagement and participation in these projects. These are not unidisciplinary projects by any means. There's a wide range of stakeholders that get involved in them. They use a whole range of project management strategies to inform their implementation components, and you can see how all of that really does start to come together in terms of not just organisational leadership and stakeholder buy-in, but also the development of comprehensive educational interventions that align the need for practice change with organisational priorities, align the need for practice change with organisational systems and processes for policy and practice development. And so what we've actually then delivered through the program is far more than a series of isolated before and after studies, you know, the pre-post test design. These people that have done these programs have delivered advanced practice improvements and transformational changes in clinical leadership. In fact, in the last 3 years, the journal has published 620 authors' work. 37 of those 620 authors have been authors across multiple papers, so that it, to me, maybe speaks to evidence that we're getting people that have some experience continuing in further implementation work, and I think that speaks to a strength that I'd like to look at more closely. The majority of papers have between 3 and 5 authors, so there's a lot of engagement occurring in how people are working together. There are 550 authors that haven't previously published with us. So that's also interesting. It seems like we've built a cohort that has a standardized skill set and knowledge base, but does having a high volume of single project authors, what does that tell us? Does that perhaps tell us that we haven't quite capitalized on this large cohort of professionals? They've got common knowledge, common methodological skills, and are we using those effectively through our business as usual model? For those of you that are familiar, QUERI was established in 1998 to accelerate the use of research evidence, tools and methods into routine care for US vets to be able to benefit from research. That's a very familiar sounding mission, isn't it? It's a little bit like JBI. JBI started with gaps, barriers and facilitators, and yet as you see on screen, that's not where QUERI started. This was a federally funded US program. It started in a traditional research domain, realised this wasn't achieving the outcome their stakeholders needed, so they switched. Their first evolutionary leap was to transition away from conventional health services research to focus on the description of gaps in the use of EBP and the description of barriers and facilitators. And almost everyone in this room could teach that course because you know it so well. Business as usual is, though, important and relevant. Our implementation studies focus on compliance and barriers to the use of EBP rather than studying the effects of interventions. Some EBP practices might be considered simple. Here's a couple of examples. Or they can be incredibly complex, as those of us in the business meeting have heard from Alexa and Lucy earlier this week. Business as usual isn't just bread and butter, it's transformational, it's capacitation, and it's collaboration in a way that other organisations, I imagine, would deeply envy, and that I think JBI should hold on to with all vigour and might. But is there something more we could be doing with business as usual? Co-contribution is an interesting example of potentially low-hanging fruit. In 2023, so this year, I led a group of third-year students from Adelaide University. They took 8 implementation reports and extracted data on where or how the 4 values that underpin the JBI EBHC model are used in publications. So we looked at culture, capacity, communication, collaboration, and how do you see them in published work, and mapped them against the CIFA 2 domains. It was a very interesting piece of work. We found that when we compare those 4 values, which we describe but don't actually articulate, and as you know, don't build through into the training programs, they map very well against CIFA 2. Frequency was identifiable, but in fact there was low consistency in how they were used within and between studies, and there was a lot of inconsistency in how they were reported. But that in itself is quite interesting, right? So maybe that is just a simplistic example of applied inquiry, a little bit evaluation, a little bit evaluative, but it was looking at a practical application and evaluation of JBI methodology. That's the kind of work third-year students could excel at in terms of the frameworks and how those students have opportunity to study. So there's a lot going on, and I probably should have talked to this slide instead. So co-contribution has this ability to really tie things together in a stronger way than we probably give credit to. And then I got interested in this. So this is Veterans Affairs again from the US. And they're looking at a second evolutionary leap, which they describe as currently ongoing. And it's the transition from descriptive studies of barriers and facilitators to specifying and testing strategies for implementation. Now, does that sound like implementation science, or does that sound like implementation science? Right? So that's where QUERI is at, and it speaks to opportunities for academic centres, for clinical tertiary centres, clinical leads, all around the world to have a say in how knowledge is created. So more recently, they've extended their mission to look at evaluation and scale-up programs that demonstrate effectiveness or use randomisation. And it sounds like they're coming full circle, but they're actually extending their reach and their ability to present with confidence the kinds of knowledge that their community require of them. So co-contribution, in this example, I'm just going to go through some of these slides fairly quickly, is types of research and research opportunities that the collaboration might find interesting. So this one shows the connection between designs and methods across the research continuum, from discovery to the study of implementation, and what some of those overlaps look like. But I believe there is space for the collaboration in this model. Then there's thinking about qualitative and QI type studies. With ethnography, for example, we could be looking at emic perspectives and analysing them in relation to culture, economics, structural features of social organisations. We could be doing qualitative comparative analysis through case study, looking at different ways to assess programmatic implementation approaches and the examination of complex systems. And we could be doing realist evaluations, looking at how we better understand what works for who in which particular contexts. There's a lot of interesting work we could be doing. It doesn't need us to move up to the pointy edge of things and start doing step wedge trials where we do cluster allocations and manage things. But boy, it would be fascinating to see what that looks like in a multi-dimensional collaboration like JBI. And then similarly, there are real rich opportunities, maybe not to lead, but at least to engage with and in hybrid trial designs as they're being practiced by others, or to be a voice in the room where hybrid trials are planned, discussed, or undertaken, because we have such a rich source of knowledge and opportunity to be part of this evaluation of the impact of the intervention and the impact of the implementation strategy. And we haven't yet done much work in that domain at all. So that could be rather fascinating. So how might we try to think about bringing some of that together? Well, we could be looking at building from our rich and diverse source of expertise, the data we already have available, the low-hanging fruit that is openly shared, sort of under that umbrella of the JBI model that gives us some certainty. We could be looking at context analysis facilitation. We could be looking at evaluation in a deeper, more structured way. And perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps it could look a little bit like this, where we have a network that isn't defined by JBI or the JBIC, but that is defined by the world in which we work. So it's inclusive of all the stakeholder groups for co-development of inquiry. And that inquiry could be conceptual, methodological, or applied across all of the groups and settings that we partner with. There are significant opportunities for studying socio-cultural aspects of the organisation and delivery of care. We have a global reach. Your being here is evidence of that global reach. Noah Ivers and I are publishing an editorial soon that simply says this: there are significant opportunities for academics and clinical partnership through parallel studies using a range of designs where quality improvement could be considered the laboratory for implementation science, and implementation science can help inform the quality improvement activities by helping us identify best practice or clarifying mechanisms of action. JBI has a global reach. It has established clinical partnerships and extensive programmatic approaches to supporting and sustaining implementation. But interestingly, these haven't really had what I would call sufficient empirical investigation. Empirics not being quantitative, it's the whole structure. JBI has the models, methods, and mechanisms of action to challenge and change the status quo. Is it now time to establish JBI's place contributing to the science as well as to the practice of closing the research practice gap? And with that, I'd like to conclude my talk. Thank you.
Great. Well done. And to time, that's amazing. I think we might have to keep that as a world record for Craig there. So just time for a couple of questions, if that's all right. You were just talking at the end about the theories, models, frameworks, and we've heard over the last few days that there are plenty of them out there. And JBI has their JBI model of evidence-based healthcare and the 7-phase implementation process. How do you see them all working together, and is there I guess, should we be looking at a framework of where they, perhaps the JBI approach is what conceptualises and operationalises it? Is that all we need, and we disregard the other approaches, or I could put that out there?
I think that's a great question. I feel like we're past the point, well past the point, where JBI can just say this is the JBI way and we leave it at that, and that's what we do. But the model that we have is a meta model. So it sits alongside, those overarching KT models that look at the whole of system. So JBI's is a whole of system model, but it's not a process description model or a process framework, is it? So there's really room, especially in thinking about implementation planning by clinicians in partnership with academic centres, to go, okay, well, we know the model tells us the value of diverse types of evidence informing synthesis, and those carry through to knowledge transfer and then into implementation. But when we get into implementation, what about determinants? Wouldn't it be great to see some study where using the JBI model, implementation gets done, but we embed COM-B in the behaviour change wheel to help identify what barriers might be best met by what behavioural determinants? Or think about, combining CFA2 with ERIC to look at different kinds of determinants and how they could be operationalised through GRIP. That's engaging with those other models without trying to recreate them or that kind of. So I think there's a lot of room for good inquiry.
I'm just going to shift for a bit, ask you to put your editor hat on of the JBI Evidence Implementation journal there. So we could see at the beginning of your presentation you showed up examples of articles that have been published in the journal, and then throughout the presentation you talked about other approaches of how you could do implementation studies. So I thought just might be really useful and really practical guidance is if you can share what kinds of studies and reports the journal is interested in accepting or receiving.
So take this as gospel. We would, if you're doing genuine work looking at implementation, we'd do our hardest to publish it. We're a society journal and we're proud of that. Case studies, observational studies, description, qualitative work. Like, when am I going to get that first action research paper that used an evidence-based framework for transformation of an area of clinical care or policy? I would love to see that. I mean, that would be stunning. So there's a lot of talented qualitative researchers in the room, and there's a lot of talented quantitative researchers in the room. Just need you to start to think about, we have the implementation training program. I'm an academic. So would part of my contribution to knowledge reasonably be that I add an element of qualitative or quantitative inquiry to the trajectory of an implementation project? If you do that, we'll not only publish it, we'll make you famous, baby.
Great. Please join me in thanking Craig for his presentation. Thank you.